Hello, this is David Saffer with Datacolor, and welcome to today's webinar, Optimizing Images for Publication. Normally we have David Toby on hand to help answer questions and do the introductions and things like that, but David is off-site today. John Walrath, another one of my colleagues, is going to be helping us with questions. So if you do have questions as we go along, type them into the question box. He'll do his best to handle them. Sometimes there's too many questions to answer them all in a timely fashion, but he'll do the best he can. I wanted to mention something about this image before we got started. You know, appearances can be a little deceiving. This photograph is not a golf course. It's actually a wheat field up in the Palouse, which is in Washington State. And the wheat in this photograph, it's around midsummer, June, is almost shoulder high. Really pretty day, and a really nice way to start the webinar with some nice color. Now, it should be noted that this presentation is more about providing guidance and giving you details of technique. I think it's important to learn the concepts and get a sense of destination. The word pre-visualization comes to mind. Book creation takes creativity, thought, and technique and software skills. So some of the things that we're going to touch on are going to be basic editing for color and tonality. We're going to talk about some highlights there. We're going to provide an introduction to the uses of retouching. We'll talk about layout and design. I'll give you some examples from a book of mine. Managing color on your computer. Optimizing your output images for resolution and sharpness, and this is an area where a lot of people do get a little bit mixed up. It varies, of course, according to what your output goals are, the size, a number of things. Some tips and helpful direction on how to communicate effectively with a printer publishing house. That's going to be an important part of this. And tips and highlights from FotoFusion. Now, FotoFusion is a software package. It's, excuse me one second. It's provided or, how can I put this? Manufactured, created by a company called LumaPix. I'll give you their web address in a little while. It's a multifaceted editing tool. They are a co-sponsor. It's a multifaceted editing tool, both for photo editing and book compositing, book layout, and things like that. Very, very powerful application. I will give you some hints and tips about FotoFusion today, but what I'm not going to do is give you a complete lesson. They have tons and tons of really good video on their website, really great technical support line. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the fundamentals of putting a book together and leave it to you to go and educate yourself about FotoFusion and the details about it. Now, as far as color editing goes, editing an image takes skill and patience. It's the kind of thing that really starts with getting it right in the camera and selecting the right images for editing. And then from that point forward, it does take a bit of trial and error. It takes a bit of practice. It takes time. It's not the kind of thing that you can do overnight. So I'm sure that in this group, as with any group, there's a mixed skill set. And it's important to remember that it's a step-by-step process, that you can edit to your heart's content, and without the background of experience, you may frequently find you get an unexpected result, that you don't quite get the colors to appear as they would in the natural world. And I think that's one of the tests of reasonableness that we can apply, is that everyday or expected colors on screen look as they do to the eye in the natural world. We'll talk about the use of color management tools, some of the basics there, including white balance in the camera. We'll talk a little bit about color targets in this section and basic color balance in your image editor. Now, the most important thing, and I've been accused of perhaps harping on this a little bit, is to get it right in the camera. There's really no substitute for getting your exposure right in the camera in particular, and that means to protect your highlights and to protect your shadows. So your histogram really has to be the mountain in the middle. Some people say shoot to the right with the histogram, maybe a little bit to the right to get a little bit more detail, but for the most part, you really want your histogram to be the mountain in the middle. One of the really useful tools that's available to you on your camera that gives you a great starting point for color and color editing is white balance. Now, there's several ways to achieve good white balance on your camera. The easiest, simplest way, although it has some flaws, is to use the white balance settings that are available as presets. And if you look here at this chart, you can see incandescent, flash, direct sunlight, etc., and they have color temperatures assigned to them. So midday direct sun, 5200, sometimes it'll be on a camera at 5500, and that will give you good color balance in normal sunlight. But take note of something. What if it's a little bit cloudy, not completely cloudy? Or what if it's a little bit closer to sunset or sunrise? That color temperature is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be exactly 5200 or 5500. Same thing applies to all of these numbers. These are middle of the road compromises. And so you have to understand that if you take a photograph and you use this color temperature, you have a starting point, even if you're shooting raw, you have a starting point that's usually an approximation. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can set the white balance in the camera or provide a tool that will help you set white balance later. But the best thing to do is to set white balance in the camera. We have a couple of tools called the Spider Checker 48 and the Spider Checker 24. They have color patch targets on one side and a gray panel on the back side. You can use those to fill the frame. You see where my cursor is pointing. Fill the frame in your camera, and using the white balance buttons or the white balance menu choices on the LCD, you can set the white balance in the camera and neutralize color in your photograph. You can also use our device called the Spider Cube, fill the frame, and go through the same exercise. And what you get from that is going to be a much more precise computation or calculation of what the white balance in the scene really is. It gets you much closer. And so there's no compromises. You're not going to necessarily be fiddling with it unless you want to from a creative standpoint. You won't be fiddling with it down the road. So here's a photograph taken in Zion National Park earlier this year. We have a wand that we got at a photo store, and we put the Spider Cube on the end. And this is another application for white balance. He's taking a photograph with the Spider Cube in the photo. Later on he's going to use this gray face and use the white balance eyedropper in Camera Raw or the white balance eyedropper in Lightroom or another image editor to white balance the photograph. The interesting thing about using a gray target is that if your lighting condition changes, you probably should reshoot this. Same thing with your in-camera custom white balance I described a minute ago. If let's say he's in a cloudy area right now, let's say it's close to sunset and the sun starts to come out, it would be a good idea to reshoot this so you can have a second target to work with in a new lighting condition. Now, this is a device called the Spider Checker. This is a 48-patch color target. The Spider Checker is very useful in much the same way that the Spider Cube is, except that it also gives you a color reference chart. This is just one half of what it does. And one would photograph this in the ambient lighting condition. In this case, I'm using continuous lighting to photograph a piece of artwork. And I would take the gray eyedropper and I would click on the 20% patch, which is right here. And this is the result. You can see that the colors are much more natural. You can see this particular line is skin tones and intermediate skin tones. The grays look gray. They don't have a tint to them. All the primary colors over here, which are in the sRGB space, look nice and natural. The red really looks red. Over here it looks like it's got a little bit of blue in it. And so once you click on this in your photograph, there are ways, and we've covered this in other webinars that are available online at Datacolor.com. Once you click on this and you set this particular raw photo to this color adjustment, you can apply that color adjustment to all the other images that were taken in the same lighting condition. Another aspect of using this particular tool, excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. Another aspect to using this particular tool is that you can photograph this and crop it to the color chart and put it through our software, which will create a camera calibration for your camera lens combination. That will give you an added degree of accuracy, color accuracy, and give you much increased control over your color in your workflow for your photography. So there's a number of ways that you can manage color either at capture or even in post-production. Now, in terms of color editing, let me just jump ahead here for a second. Yeah. In terms of color editing, when you do your color editing, there's a number of manipulations that you can do, which would include hue and saturation. You could do curves and levels adjustments, which may or may not affect the color. But I think some of the fundamentals that people overlook is, first of all, select the right images. And this is a good example. This is an older image of mine. This is taken in the Antelope Canyons. But it has a really good, really broad tonal range and some good challenges in the midtones. Let's talk about that for a minute. This image was remarkably easy to edit because you just start to lose a little bit of the shadow detail in a relatively unimportant area. If you blew this up to a big print, you would see the details in the shadows here. You've got good mid-tone transitions. You can see the shadows move smoothly from darker to lighter areas. And the highlight areas hold up the detail, just barely. So you have pretty much the full dynamic range in this photograph. This is an image that's worth editing. Now, you can't really, turn that sow's ear into a silk purse. If the image doesn't hold up, if it's been shot too hot, for example, and this area back here is pure white, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to restore the highlights in that area, much less get decent color in it. So you have to select the right images. Now, if you're working on color editing, and I'll show you a little bit of this when I show you the book examples, you also want to create collections. And in fact, there's a tool in the FotoFusion software that allows you to create collections by theme or whatever. But topic, place, time, design. You want to create collections of images and harmonize what I call design themes, or that's a good way to put it, a design theme for your book, so that the images hold together, they support each other. An image by itself has to stand on its own. It's a different story than a book where you have a collection of images where they really have to harmonize, the colors have to stick together well, the subjects have to stick together well, and you really need to think about how you're going to put those together side by side. I've seen some people take a more of a scrapbooking approach, which is a different level of artistry, and they don't necessarily do that. They're more considered with, they're more considering the time or the place and the chronology of a family or of an event and that sort of thing, and so you may have a series of photographs that show you how things happened one after the other. That's valid, but for most photography books, what I would like to see people do more of is to collect their images around specific goals or specific elements. So the design, colors, shapes, time of day, the place, that sort of thing. That's the place where a lot of people could really improve their work. And of course, you want to harmonize the tonal range, and you want to put together a collection of images that really support each other. I think I've said that twice, so I'll move on. And you also want to have in the image some fundamental color accuracy. You don't want to put yourself in the position where you have images that are so close to the extremes that you really have to twist them and manipulate them in your image editor. And it's going to show when you put them together in a collection. Each one of those images that has been heavily manipulated is going to have certain distortions in it. And all of those distortions add up on the page. So you want to start off with an image, what we like to say, it has good bones, it has good structure. It's giving you a lot to look at, and it harmonizes or fits together with the other images that are going to go in your book. Let's talk a little bit about retouching And I think when you're talking about retouching, you have to consider the difference between retouching and photo manipulation. And I got this out of Wikipedia, and I almost never do this, but I put this definition in here word for word. Photo manipulation is the application of image editing techniques to photographs in order to create an illusion or deception after the original photographing took place. An enhancement or correction is known as retouching. So if you're building a style for your collection and you're doing retouching, some things that are portrait retouching and not manipulation could include removing a stray hair or blemishes, creating a vignette, correcting skin tones, those sorts of things. In landscape, you might remove wires. I can't tell you how many beer cans I've taken out of landscapes. Poles, people walking through your photo, they do that, unfortunately. In fine art photography, there are times, for example, where even if you're photographing a floral arrangement in a studio, eventually you wind up moving one flower to another and it turns into a photo manipulation. And so, you know, there can be a sort of a thin line in between retouching and manipulation. And then, of course, composite images do belong in that separate category of photo manipulation. The point I'm trying to make is that the retouched images where you're leaving very light footprints, if any at all, in fact, most people shouldn't be able to tell what you've done, is a far different thing than manipulation. It's probably not a good idea in a book to try and mix those two styles. Remember I talked about building a collection? And I wanted to make the point here, I'm not really trying to teach you about how to do retouching or manipulation. I'm trying to make a point here about harmonizing the images in your book. And I would try to keep those two styles separate, at least in different sections of the book. You may say, this is a portfolio, or this is a retrospective, and you may have sections in the book and you may have retouched images in one part and manipulated images in another. That's fine. But please try not to mix them on the same page or on facing pages, because I think it's a dissonant kind of thing. I think it startles the reader in some cases or makes them wonder about what you're really presenting in your work. Now, optimizing images for output, this is an important thing. It's a workflow issue. Optimizing images for output really starts when you take the photograph, or even when you're thinking about composing it, about putting up your tripod or moving around with your camera. And you start with the camera and you shoot raw if possible. And it's really important to nail the exposure. Even with the modern DSLRs with a full frame sensor shooting in raw, it's far better to nail the exposure and work from there than it is to take a photograph that's extreme either in terms of the exposure settings or the dynamic range or contrast in the scene, because it makes it too hard. It makes it too hard to harmonize the images together. For example, if you had a scene outdoors that you're pointing the camera in one direction and it's high contrast with really deep shadows, really constricted mid-tone transitions, and really bright highlights, and you put that next to softer images when the clouds came out, they may not work well together. You're going to need to use a color management tool, which we mentioned before, okay, and it's important to white balance your camera ahead of time. I forgot to mention something which is also important. If you do a custom white balance in your camera and you're taking a raw photograph, the camera is still showing you a JPEG on the screen. Now, what that JPEG is composed of, it's a snapshot, if you will, or a calculated thumbnail of the raw image. So whatever you see on that screen depends on how good your white balance, it depends in part on how good your white balance is, depends in part on how good your exposure is. If you do an in-camera white balance, you're going to get a better JPEG. The JPEG is driving your histogram, you're going to get a better histogram. So it's all working in your favor. You're stacking the deck in your favor when you do these things. Now, use a camera sensor that fits your output goals. If you're going to make a large format book and you're shooting with a pocket point and shoot or a compact camera, that sensor size is probably not your friend. That may be an issue where you're going to be trying to enlarge images from a small sensor, and they're not going to hold up when they're enlarged. It may be a sensor that can only produce, say, a 6:8 photograph, and you want to make an 11:14 or 12:18 coffee table book. You're in trouble. Much better to have a camera sensor. I in fact, gotten to the point where I tend to favor the full-frame sensor cameras because they give me more latitude in cropping. They give me more real estate to work with. Certainly the full-frame and the APS-C size frame, sensors render the same quality of color and depth of color, but the larger sensor gives you more room to work with in terms of just photographic real estate. Now, some people shoot JPEGs in RAW. Some people just shoot JPEGs. It doesn't really matter which color space you start with in your camera if you are only shooting RAW. If you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, I would recommend that you pick a color space for your JPEGs, either sRGB or Adobe 98, and stick with it. It's not a good idea to be changing back and forth. It gives you a mixed bag in your collections. And sRGB is a more constrained color space than Adobe 98. They don't necessarily edit to the same destination. Sometimes they will and sometimes they won't. So once you start with a selected color space with the JPEG, stick with it all the way through to your final output. If you need to upsize an image for output, do this during your RAW processing if possible. It's better to do it then, and that's part of either the camera RAW output dialog or the Lightroom output dialog. You can specify the size of your output JPEG or TIFF file. Those are the files that you're going to use in your layout when you get into the FotoFusion software, for example. But what you want to do is, if you're going to upsize that image for output, do it there rather than trying to resize it in another software package. And here's the reason. If you're upsizing a RAW image, you're actually not upsizing a photograph. What you're doing is asking the computer to recalculate the file size, the pixels that are available to you. And so it does much less damage. There's less digital artifact if you upsize the image early in the game rather than later in the game. Now when you convert that RAW file to a TIFF or JPEG and you start to edit it, you're not working uphill. You've got an image that's already been resized with minimal damage or no damage at all, and now you're starting fresh with that file. When you start to do color edits and highlight and shadow edits and other things on it, after you've gotten it out of the RAW processor, the image is much more prone to damage and showing digital artifacts. Now, generally, what you'll want are output images set to a resolution of 300, but you do want to ask, if you're going to be using an outside print provider, do ask them what they want to see. Some of them will say 150, some will say 180, some will say 300, some will say 360. It depends on the printing machine that they're using. But what you don't want to do is send them an image with resolution that's different than what their manufacturing setup is asking for. As far as sharpening goes, what's needed depends on the original image sharpness. In other words, a really sharp image, typically, in many cases, will not need much sharpening or any sharpening. I have colleagues and friends that have cameras that are so sharp that the images don't need any sharpening at all. A couple of examples would be a Nikon D800, or I think now the new model is the D810. Another camera that doesn't need any sharpening is one that I'm fortunate enough to own, which is a Hasselblad with a Phase 1 back. Never needs to have the image sharpened. In both cases, what's happened is the sensor has what's called the anti-aliasing filter removed. The images are extremely sharp. With a good glass, you can really see the details. Now, in a lot of cameras, they do have an anti-aliasing filter, and you are going to have to do some sharpening. Now, in landscape, if you think back to your unsharp mask dialog, the amount of the sharpening can be as high as 200 to 300, but I would encourage you to keep the radius in most cases under 1. 0.7 or 0.8 is a good starting point. And in landscapes that have a pretty decent dynamic range, you want to push the threshold anywhere. Well, I probably should have said 4 to 8. It really depends on the image. There's no harm in experimenting. If you're working in Photoshop, I do recommend you do your sharpening on a separate layer. And I guarantee the picture police will not come to your house if you experiment with this. So you can work back and forth, particularly on a layer, and see how it's going to turn out. If you start to see halos or bright lines on your contrast areas, the sharpening may be too aggressive. Now, there's a thing to think about, which is that your display is going to show sharpening in a different way than your print output. The display is a little more sensitive. It's going to show you the halos before the printer will. So in this case, and I do this a lot actually, it's one of my main reasons for proofing an image. You may want to make a proof at roughly the size that you're going to use for your final output, and then take it over to a nice bright light and look at it closely and see how much distortion you have on the contrast lines or on the detail lines, and see if it's acceptable. And you will often find that what looks like a little bit too much sharpening on screen can be not so bad in the print. Now for portraits, it's much less aggressive. Your starting amount would be less than 100. The radius would be much less than 1, and the threshold is probably 2 to 4. And there's a little tip here as far as sharpening goes in either case, is that there's no harm in doing half this amount and then doing it again. And you can add it in increments and see how it goes. So you don't have to do it all in one shot. Sometimes sharpening progressively will give you a better result than sharpening in one step. So that's something to think about. Now, when you're working on your production and you're thinking about putting a collection of images together for a book, it's also important to remember to apply sharpening to individual images, not the entire page. When you're working in your layout, you may have borders, text, other things. You wind up sharpening things that don't need sharpening. I also want to mention that if you're sharpening an image, you may not want to sharpen the entire image, and this is a subject for another day. I know that we have some of this material in our recorded webinars. You may want to use what's called a layer mask and only sharpen the portions of the image that you want to stand out. A portrait is the obvious example. You want to sharpen areas like the eyes, the eyebrows, the nose, and the lips, and leave the skin and maybe even the hair alone, depending on your taste, and let the rest of the image fall out. If you're shooting a landscape where you have a foreground, a midground, and a background, you may want that background, which has a lot of nice bokeh that you already put in there because you were shooting at a fairly wide aperture. You may not want to sharpen that area, and again, you may want to use a layer mask to apply selective sharpening to the important parts of the image. So these are all things to think about when you're starting to put your book together. Now, in terms of layout and design, you have to think about on each page or on the cover, do you want a single image? Do you want multiple images? Do you want a multi-image book-style layout, which I'll show you in just a moment? If you're going to be printing single images, they can be used in a loose-leaf portfolio. You can print multiple images on single sheets. I do that a lot for my own presentations to clients. Book layouts are more complex. You've got single-page designs, you've got following page designs, you've got images that will run over with the gutter, which is the spine of the book in the middle. I'll show you that in a minute. And again, some of your design considerations are going to be the harmony of the subjects, the colors, the design, the leading lines, the rule of thirds, the photo's face in or outward, which I'll show you in a moment, and that sort of thing. So here's an example from one of my earlier books. And this dotted line represents the gutter, the fold in the middle of the page, of the two pages. Now, you can see that we've got a big mass. I'm going to talk a little bit about layout, design, and some of the considerations here when you're putting photos together. You've got a big mass over here, and it has a lot of shadow areas, very dramatic. This is an Antelope Canyon. This is a formation that's probably 10 or 12 feet high. So it's very dramatic, very heavy. that sort of thing. And then you have two lighter images, smaller images with smaller masses, certainly brighter colors in the middle, maybe a little bit darker on the end. But the two images on the right, in terms of weight, visual weight, tend to balance the image on the left. They're also in the same color palette. They're more or less in the same range of colors, although the tonality difference is different in some respects. The brightest highlights are more or less in the same area. You could say that this is one exception, along with this area here where there's some mineral deposits on the wall of the cliff. But the images work well together. This is a good example of building your collections and harmonizing images for publication. Now, talk about images facing together. This image on the upper right was flipped so that we could have it facing the same way as the other duck. And of course, the seals are facing back towards them. So the eye tends to go in a circle here. And this black line in the middle is, of course, your gutter, your center line. And again, the mass is balanced partly because this image covers more than one page. And these two split up pages have fairly strong central elements to them. Notice that the image on the left more or less sticks pretty well to the rule of thirds, the way the masses are, and you can see leading lines here in echoing triangles there, echoing triangles in the structure, that sort of thing. There's an echoing triangle here on the heads of the two ducks. And so these images, for a number of reasons, work well together. They're all about water. They're about animals in the natural world, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of thought put into selecting these images, and believe me, at the time we had hundreds to work from. Now, this is a totally different part of the book. You can see here that they're taken in the same area. In fact, this part of the plaza is actually right here in this photograph. It's one of the reasons they were put together. So this is the back side, and this is the front side. This is looking at it basically from the southeast, and this is looking at it more or less from the west. Now, the color palettes, the sky, the architecture, the mood, all of those things fit well together. And again, making the point that when you build your image collections, this is part of what you want to see in your book layouts. Now, I could have had several photographs here, but I really wanted to show you the scope of the landscape, particularly on the cloudy day. It gives it some sense of scale. You know, the sky and the buildings and all those sorts of things. The people are invisible, they're just too small. But over here you get another sense of scale. You can see a doorway here and an archway here, and you get a sense of what the place looks like from more than one perspective. So again, they work well together. Let's talk about managing color on your computer. We talked about managing color in the camera, but let's talk about managing color on your computer. Your display is your gateway to your photographs, your images, your designs, your illustrations. The display is one of the most important tools that you own, and it's important to calibrate your display. You can't calibrate your display by eye. The human eye and brain just don't work that way. They're too adaptable. What happens is if there's any ambient light, or if there's sunshine coming in through one of your windows, which is not such a great idea, or you've been outdoors in the sun for a little while, or you're fatigued, all of those things affect your color vision. I found that in the evenings I'm much less adept at correcting and manipulating color than I am first thing in the morning when I'm at least supposedly wide awake. So calibrating the display means that your display is always going to give you back the same thing. It's going to give you sky blues, the grass will be green, the ocean will be blue, the buildings that are supposed to be this beautiful warm color will be this beautiful warm color. And it will make it much easier for you to achieve the harmony between the images that you're working on than any other method I can think of. Now, in display calibration, you also have to think about your working environment. It's important. In fact, I put this image up here partly just to show you how it works, but also to give you an idea of what a room that's too bright might look like. this room that this photograph was taken in is too bright for the purpose of display calibration. It really needs to be about half that luminance level. And here's the reason. If you calibrate to this level, it's going to adjust the screen brightness to compensate. That's going to be too bright for almost any printer output I can think of. What's going to happen? Your prints are going to be too dark. You're going to look at the image on screen, you're going to adjust it down, you're going to drive the luminance level down to compensate. You're going to get your prints back from the printer and you're going to discover your prints are too dark. It's an automatic thing. Whenever someone comes up to me at a trade show or a conference or a workshop and they say, my prints are too dark, I say, your screen is too bright. The key to getting your screen brightness down is to get your environment brightness under control. That may mean putting shades or a curtain over your windows. And just having one or two modest lamps in the room so you can move around and things like that without tripping over a dog or a cat, and get that working environment working in your favor. The calibration sequence is something I think that a lot of you will be familiar with, so I'll try to be brief. Fundamentally, what it's going to do, the software is going to run a series of color patches. The first time you calibrate, it's going to take anywhere from, say, 10, 15 minutes, and this device, the spider, is going to read those color patches and decide is the color patch correct or not. It's going to save the corrections. It's going to write a file called a profile. Every time you boot your computer, that profile is going to be read and the screen will be corrected to give you accurate, pleasing colors. Now, how often do you have to do that? I get asked that question quite a bit. On most computer displays, you want to do that once a month. That's because the backlight is it's an illumination source. It's a little bit like a series of light bulbs. You're going to find that over time it is going to change. Most display screens last 3 to 4 years, and then they have to be replaced. The point, though, is that if you do calibrate your display, you're going to have a much better chance of getting a screen-to-print match. In other words, what you see is what you get. It's a little bit disconcerting to know that you've got a bill coming up for a bunch of prints that you've had made, or you've got your own printer and you've made a bunch of prints and then you realize it's not what you expected. And then unexpected result is expensive. A display calibration device, amongst all the other things that you have as photographers and artists, is a relatively inexpensive item that really leverages the technology that's sitting on your desk. Gives you a much better chance, you know, as a baseball coach of mine used to say, program yourself for success. Couple of screenshots for the software. I wanted you to take note of something. This is going to be a recorded webinar, so you don't have to scribble all this down. This is one of the software screens that comes up when you start this. You can see that it's very user-friendly. I want you to take note of the settings. The gamma of 2.2, there's always been some controversy and discussion about that since the beginning of time almost. But gamma 2.2 is the recommended setting. You want a white point of 6500, which will give you a very neutral appearance. You want your brightness to be at around 120. 120, maybe a little higher, is the level where you can have a reasonably good chance of getting a good screen-to-print match, even if you're getting it printed off-site. If you're seeing levels that are in the 160 to 180 range, your room is too bright, your prints are going to be too dark. We also have a tool that lets you see what the difference in calibrated versus non-calibrated states. The one on the right is a non-calibrated version. You can see, for example, that the green in the garden here and the blue in the sky are just not what they're supposed to be. And if you look over here on the upper left, you can see that the colors are much more vibrant, natural looking. They pass that test of reasonableness. So it really gives you a shot at getting colors where they need to be. We also include the color chart. Each of these 4 segments, if you click on them, they will enlarge to fill the screen so you can see all the black and whites, all the portrait shots, all of these sort of artsy shots with the chart, and the outdoor shots, and you can switch it back and forth from your calibrated to your uncalibrated view so you can evaluate the results. Let's talk a little bit about LumaPix and FotoFusion. Again, high-end application. We're not here to review or teach the software or workflow because there's plenty of instructional video on site and they have good telephone support. But it's important to spend time learning the software. I was talking to one of the people from the company earlier this morning, and they said the one mistake that people make, as hard as they try to make the software intuitive and provide the support, the one mistake that people make is that they open the software and they dive into the middle and they don't really pay attention to the instructions and they get in trouble. It's much simpler and it's much easier to go through some of the instructional materials, take you a few hours, learn the software, and then practice. Take some of your existing layouts, and I think many of us know just how hard it is to do layouts in Photoshop and InDesign and Lightroom. Take some of those layouts and try to mimic them in FotoFusion. And use what you've already got. Use existing images and work with them and mimic something that you've seen or mimic something that you've already created, and then go for the advanced project. And if there's a key takeaway in this presentation, this is in the top 3. You know, get it right in the camera is certainly one of them, but getting familiar with this, and a good analogy would be you've got a wedding shoot or a portrait shoot or a trip to the Grand Canyon planned for tomorrow, and you've got your trusty Canon camera in your bag, and then the new Nikon camera that you ordered arrives from Amazon. And you pull it out of the box and you charge the battery and you put it in your camera bag and you take it with you and you start shooting with it the next day. It's not going to be a very smooth experience. I think many of us know that from our own lives. It's the kind of thing that takes practice and familiarity, knowing where the buttons are, just knowing where they are, knowing where to find things, what happens when you do A versus B versus C, those sorts of things. So don't get the software and then try to do a big job the next day. Get the software in advance. They even have a trial version. Get the software in advance and go through some exercises and build some layouts or even a book and use that as a starting point. And then go for your more advanced project. Now, I do want to talk to you about output and color. There's a couple of slides on this. We talked a little bit about getting color right at the beginning, and now we're going to talk about getting color right at the end. The first thing is to try and keep all of your images in the same color space. Now, that means that, let's say you've shot in RAW. You're going to output those image files to TIFFs or JPEGs. And in the dialog box, there's going to be a choice of color space. There's going to be at least sRGB, Adobe 98, and ProPhoto. Now, a lot of the people who are making prints outside are looking for sRGB. That's what they're set up to do, so you need to know that in advance. A lot of desktop printers, if you're working in that direction, a lot of the desktop printers are getting close to Adobe 98. It's a bigger color space. You may want to consider setting up your workflow to handle that. However you do it, you want to try and keep all the images in the same color space in a particular project. And in fact, what I'd suggest as you go forward is try to systematize your workflow so that you're always working in the same color space. I typically am working either in Adobe 98 or ProPhoto, and then at the end of the major edits, I output folders of images for specific uses. So if I wanted to do a website, I would output a folder of small JPEGs, which are sharpened more than they would be for a larger image in most cases. And then they would all be in sRGB. That seems to work best on the web. I hope I said that in an understandable way. If you're going to be making a series of prints on your desktop printer, you may want to output those files in Adobe 98 and then make your prints. A little tip, if your output service is asking you for CMYK, this is another color space, and this is from the days of 4-color press. CMYK conversions from RGB workflow are difficult. It takes practice and expertise, and it also takes some knowledge of the peculiarities of a particular output device. So one CMYK press could differ significantly from another CMYK press. There's different models, manufacturers. Some of them are older than others. Some have better operators. It's better to have the service bureau make the conversion for you. If you need to, make a print on your desktop printer so they have a reference for color, they know what you want to see, and send that along with your order. But I would discourage you from trying to do CMYK conversions unless you've got a lot of background that's, it's a little bit unusual to have that kind of background. Certainly in my own photography business, if someone wants CMYK, I will give them a file in Adobe 98 and say, have the service bureau do the conversion for you. They're the only ones who are going to do a good job. The only thing that's going to happen if I do it is it's going to be different than what they want. So just take that lesson, stick it in your pocket for a rainy day. Now, one of the other things that's available to us in the FotoFusion software, and I think I should make a special point of this, is I want to talk about how it passes when it's creating your output file for the book. First of all, I want you to remember your sharpening tips. Sharpen those images ahead of time, before you're in the book. Edit your images in your main image editor, and here's the reason, is that you can achieve a split workflow. They've set the software up so that you can edit, for example, in Lightroom or Photoshop and save it to a folder. Then you can import that file into FotoFusion, and you can do your layouts. And let's say you've got one image that just doesn't quite fit on the page. It doesn't have the right color temperature. Go back to Lightroom or Photoshop, make the adjustment, hopefully using soft proofing, and it will automatically update in the FotoFusion software. A very elegant split workflow. So you don't have to re-import the photo. You can go back to the more powerful and in some cases more familiar image editor, do your thing, save the file. As soon as you save the file to the same location, of course, it will update it in the layout. Now, when you're dealing with a printing house or a lab, it's important to try and create a partner. I know a lot of people that are lab hoppers. I call them lab hoppers. They go from lab to lab because they can get a slightly different price or there's a special on that week. But here's the problem, is that each lab is set up differently. They may have a Mac, they may have Windows, they may have an Indigo press, or they may have an Epson 7800. They could have anything. It gets to be really difficult to know what's going to happen once you put that stuff in the mail. So get used to, find a good lab, build a relationship with them, and try to avoid the lab hopping. You're going to find that if you stick with somebody consistently and they're willing to work with you, they can become your business partner or your partner in creating your art. It's a good idea, particularly the first time you're doing a job, to ask for proofs on media, on the media that's going to be used in the book. And it doesn't have to be a big proof. 2 or 3 pages will do the job. When I got this book, I was fortunate enough to be working with an organization who was helping to pay the bills, so I got a complete mock-up of the book in loose leaf form, and I went through and marked it up and sent it back to them. But that's usually not a luxury that you have, particularly as a sole proprietor. Now, let's see here. I missed a page. Where to go? Here it is. One of the things that's important in the output section in the FotoFusion software is I want you to take note that there's a number of choices that you have, and I want to point to just a couple of them and give you a heads up. And you can learn more about this on their site. This says convert to sRGB and tag with sRGB. This is perhaps the safest and most common choice. The sRGB is the one that a lot of labs want to be working with anyway. If you're working with a bunch of images that are, say, in Adobe 98, you might pick the second choice, which is to pass through the profiles unchanged and tag with the common profile. So you've got choices here in terms of your output color space. Pay attention to those, become more familiar with what those choices mean, pros and cons, and make sure that you are sending the best possible output file to your print service provider so you get the best possible result. So we're going to do a quick wrap up. Keep in mind that concepts and direction come first. The rules about pre-visualization, the ones that you've heard so many times before, are very important. Knowing where you want to go is going to dictate how you operate in creating your art and your photographs. And the basic photo rules do still apply, even if you're going to make a book, is that in your image editing, your highlight and shadow detail, your color fidelity, all of those things, working with the rule of thirds, achieving harmony in tones and composition on a particular page. And I'm just going to jump back and say, let's see, that's the one I want. That's a pretty good harmony of tones and composition in that case. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see people achieve. It's relatively simple. It doesn't try to crowd the pages. The subject matter works between the three images, etc., etc. And be gentle. Go step by step with your image edits. You know, if you go too fast and you try to take big bites, typically you're going to leave a lot of digital artifacts. If your feet are heavy, you leave those digital footprints. Those are not kind to you. Do your sharpening in increments and see how it goes. Color management is a cornerstone of your success. Getting it right in the camera, getting your exposure right, nailing your exposure even if it's in RAW. You know, the old saying used to be, one of the falsehoods in life is, we'll fix it in Photoshop. Well, it's still true, even if it's a RAW file. If you don't get it right in the camera, it's much harder to fix it in Photoshop. So get your color management going, get it right, control the color in your camera, control the color on display on your screen. Take a look at our webinars and learn about on-screen proofing. And practice with the software and the designs and the concepts before starting a serious project, just like you would with a new camera. You don't go out and do a serious photo shoot with a new camera. You don't go out and do a serious project with new software and new techniques. And it's important to communicate effectively with the outside services. The outside print services, proofing is key, I think, to working with them. I found that if I'm doing it blind, even if I've been dealing with the same lab, I'm going to get an unexpected result from time to time. What I normally do now is I send in a batch of photos. I send in 1 or 2 photos that I've used many times in the past. I know exactly what they're supposed to look like. And so if they come back and they don't look right, probably the whole job has got a problem. So there's a little tip that will save you some time and maybe some heartburn. Now, why is that all the way over there? Here we go. Webinars and more. Here's a few tips for you. Our website is spider.datacolor.com, and we have dozens of recorded webinars on focus controls, remote triggering, soft proofing, convergence of still and video, floral photography, architectural photography. We've really tried to get away from simply talking about our products and get into what can help you be a better photographer. Now we have an example of a new webinar coming up, Screen to Print Match, which would include a lot more detail about how to work with soft proofing and some of the more advanced topics that we only brushed on here today. We have conferences coming up. We'll be working with the Shane Hurlbut Illumination Tour, which is video production. It starts this weekend in California and then goes on to Texas and other cities. And I encourage you to just Google Shane Hurlbut Illumination Tour, and the link will come up. I forgot to put it here. We'll also be at Photo Plus in New York City. For those of you on the East Coast and you'll be around at the end of October, I strongly encourage you to stop by that show. I think it's one of the best photo shows in the world. We'll be there. Be happy to help you and answer questions and that sort of thing. So I want to say thank you to Datacolor and LumaPix for sponsoring this webinar. You can see the web addresses up here, datacolor.com, LumaPix with an X.com. We have a couple of giveaways, and I'll announce the names in just a moment. The Datacolor Spider 4 Pro and the LumaPix FotoFusion Extreme. We also have discounts. We have a 20% discount off all Datacolor Spider products purchased on our website. It excludes these two products, the Spider HD and the Spider Checker 24. Those are new products. The discount code is Optimize20. It's valid through the 17th. 20% off LumaPix products purchased on their website. The discount code is Datacolor20, and that is valid through October 14th. Now let me see if I can get the winners on the screen here. Where did it go? There it is. All right, the LumaPix winner is Ralph Vasquez, and the Spider 4 Pro winner is Annie Kosh. I hope I pronounced that right. I apologize if I didn't. Ralph and Annie, our marketing manager, is going to be getting in touch with you via email to make arrangements to have these items shipped to you. I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope you'll join us again. It's been a fun session. I hope you got something out of it. And again, take a look at the website for some of the recorded webinars. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.